That is what's known as a diminished seventh chord. It's the chord typically associated with feelings of shock, horror, surprise. You know, the twist at the end of an old cheesy movie. It was you all along! That kind of thing. Now you may be wondering why I'm talking about such a spooky sounding chord in a video about Mac DeMarco. Maybe you're also wondering why I'm at the piano. Isn't Mac DeMarco guitar music? While it is true that DeMarco's signature sound relies heavily on guitars, today I'll be talking about the underlying harmonies that make his songs his own. Chords at the end of the day are not something strictly for guitarists, which is why I've elected to use keys today. As to the question of why talk about that strange chord, well, here's the thing. Even though musicals, movies, and TV have taught us to associate it with some kind of plot twist or something like that, it's by no means the only use for it. It may be the case that on its own this chord evokes those feelings, but like with most things in music, context can change everything. Any great composer or songwriter knows this, but today I want to talk only about DeMarco, who in practically no instance uses these chords to evoke shock or fear or any of those emotions. He instead uses them to express more sentimental and nostalgic feelings. Canadian singer-songwriter Mac DeMarco stormed onto the indie music scene in the early 2010s with a handful of self-produced, self-performed albums, some of which considered by many to be modern classics. I personally got hooked on DeMarco back in high school. There's a certain nostalgia his music evokes that totally spoke to me at the time. And I don't mean that in the sense of, oh, remember how great the 60s or the 70s were? No, I mean the actual feeling of nostalgia. In my opinion, no work highlights this characteristic of his music more than his sophomore album, 2. This album is packed to the brim with diminished chords. First of all, to make sure we're all on the same page here, let's take a look at how to build a diminished chord. A diminished chord is basically just a string of minor thirds. In other words, you take a note, and you jump from it in 3 subsequent leaps of 3 keys each. For instance, if we wanted to find C diminished 7, we would start with C, then walk up to E flat, from E flat to G flat, and then from G flat to A. C diminished 7. For you guitarists out there, here are some good shapes for playing the chord, with the root always in the bass. So remember that chord I played at the beginning of the video? Well, that just happens to be the second chord of the verse of Freaking Out the Neighborhood. Sorry, Mama. It's a great example of what I was referring to when I said that context changes everything. More specifically, harmonic context, meaning where the chord falls in relationship to the rest of the chords in the song. The context here is that this part of the song is in the key of B major. We start on a B major chord, and then move to the B diminished 7th. This is known as our 1 diminished 7th because it stems from the first note of the key we're in. The 1. It's really common in those old jazz standards, which might be part of the reason it feels so nostalgic. It also appears in a lot of bossa nova music, which has a tinge of melancholy itself. Mac himself states that he's heavily inspired by bossa nova hero Jorge Gilberto. Another reason this chord sounds so satisfying is the fact that the chord after it is G sharp minor 7, which shares many of the same notes as B diminished 7. They both share B and G sharp, and the other 2 pairs of notes, D to D sharp and F to F sharp, are only a half step apart. This phenomenon, known as voice leading, is by no means even remotely new. But I must say, off the top of my head, I can't think of another song that goes from 1 diminished 7 to the 6 minor 7, so it's definitely distinct. The same technique is employed on another song on the album, Stars Keep on Calling My Name. Honey, the stars keep on calling my name. Really does sound like a jazz standard. The song is in the key of G major. It starts on a G major chord, and to get from there to the 3rd chord, A minor, we go through a diminished chord built a half step above A minor, B flat diminished 7. In this example, the notes E and G are preserved in both chords, and the notes B flat and D flat go down to A and C. Now let's look at a different way Mac uses diminished chords on the song Ode to Viceroy, a silly yet charming love song about a cigarette brand. This was the one that turned me on to DeMarco's music, and it's worth talking about now because right out of the gate it hits us with a diminished chord, although with a twist. Let's take a look. The song starts off with a D sharp half diminished. Now half diminished are like diminished 7th chords, But instead of taking the minor third, minor third, minor third formula, it goes minor third, and then a major third. That is a leap of 4 keys. Let's take a listen to the difference between a diminished 7th chord and a half diminished 7th chord. Here's the diminished 7th chord, and here's the half diminished chord. Sounds a bit more wide and open. Once again, this chord is made pleasurable due to context and voice leading. The song is in the key of A major, and after this D sharp half diminished chord, we get a D major 7. Notice how D sharp half diminished and D major 7 share all the same notes, save the first. Now D major 7 is what we call the 4 major 7 chord of this key, and I've always found that chord quite dreamy, as I've mentioned in my video about Tame Impala. Maybe Mac took that jarring half diminished chord and moved it down to the pleasurable major 7 chord to evoke the tension and release feeling one gets after getting their cigarette fix. Could be a stretch, and I'm sure he didn't think about it in those terms, but I do like to imagine some kind of subconscious link like that did happen. Let's wrap things up here by talking about the use of the half diminished chord in Mac's most popular song. Well, at least as far as YouTube view count is concerned. Before we do so though, if you liked the video, clicking like, subscribe, and the little bell button would go a long way in supporting the channel. And I'm always looking for new artists to analyze. So if there's anyone you'd want to see, let me know in the comments. Okay, so in My Kind of Woman, Mac uses a half diminished chord to modify one of the biggest cliches in pop music, the 4 minor chord. This chord is smothered all over pop hits. I even talked about it in my last video about the Bee Gees song, How Deep Is Your Love? There I called it the money chord, as many others do. Going back to My Kind of Woman, chorus of the song is in the key of A major. Mac hangs around an A major chord with an ascending bass line, moves to a B minor 7 chord, and then finally our B half diminished chord. You're my kind of woman. We'll call this chord the 2 half diminished because it stems from the 2nd note of the key. But what does that have to do with 4 minor? Well, the 4th note of A major is D, therefore our 4 minor would be D minor. Now notice that all the notes of D minor are in the chord B half diminished. Let's hear the chord progression with a 4 minor, and then with a half diminished. When we put B in the bass, it adds a little extra spice to the chord. This is also something that was quite popular in the jazz era, but slowly went out of style in favor of the slightly simpler sounding 4 minor chord. Mac brings back this gorgeous variation to an old cliché to put a bow on the climax of one of his most passionate songs. Now one can only go so far throwing diminished chords all over the place, and Mac has many other harmonic tricks up his sleeve. Let's also not forget his impeccable ear for production, his great guitar skills, and his ability to deliver a melody that is direct and honest. Nonetheless, it's deep dives like these into singular concepts that can show us the awesome extent to which harmony affects us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.